great turnout.
Great.
Hello, my name is Michael Bloomquist. I'm a clinical psychologist and I'm on the faculty here at the U of M Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences. And it's my pleasure to introduce our grand round speaker today, Dr. David Yaden. Just a couple of points about a brief overview of his work and training. He completed his master's training in psychology at the University of Pennsylvania, working with Andrew Newberg. He and Dr. Newberg have co-authored a forthcoming book on William James, which is a 21st century update on James' classic, The Varieties of Spiritual Experience. He completed his doctoral training in psychology at the University of Pennsylvania, working with Martin Seligman, widely acknowledged as one of the founders, if not the founder, of positive psychology. His work with Dr. Seligman at Pennsylvania focused on psychometrics and computational linguistics analysis methods of life-changing positive experiences. He's currently a postdoc research fellow at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine, working with Roland Griffiths, and they are working together on examining subjective and behavioral effects of psychedelics and their clinical potential, which is the topic of our rounds today. When I look at and examine some of the work that Dr. Yaden has completed, there's an underlying theme of understanding transcendent experience and altered states of consciousness and the potential to use these experiences to enable humans to transform and thrive. This includes work in spiritual religious experience, secular transcendent experience, such as moments of awe, as well as psychedelics. His work has examined measurement, neuroscience processes, and clinical applications. He's also done some work in the area related to positive psychology and promoting well-being. In a relatively brief academic career, Dr. Yaden has published 36 peer-reviewed articles with many in top journals. He's written or edited 3 books. He's authored or co-authored numerous book chapters. His scientific and scholarly work has been covered by the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, New York Magazine, and NPR. Today's grand rounds presented by Dr. Yaden is on the topic of psychedelics and psychiatry. I understand this will be an overview of historical work in this area, current status, and future directions, as well as examining his own work in this area. On behalf of the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences, I would like to welcome you, Dr. Yaden.
Thank you so much, Mike. I appreciate it. Thank you, Sophia. I had great meetings this morning with Glenn, Debbie, and Jessica. I really wish I was up there in person with you all, but very grateful to be here presenting to you today remotely. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay, and if you could just give me a thumbs up if you're seeing what I hope you're seeing, which is my title screen. Great, thank you. Okay, so yes, thank you for that introduction, Mike. I'm at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine now in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences in the BPRU, Behavioral Pharmacology Research Unit. I've been there long enough to love my lab and the department, but not long enough to get used to the S in Johns of Johns Hopkins, which doesn't make sense to me and I don't think ever will. So a bit about me by way of my main advisors. So with Andrew Newberg, I worked on the neuroscience of altered states of consciousness, specifically those considered highly meaningful religious, spiritual, or mystical experiences, doing some neuroimaging work as well as non-invasive brain stimulation using transcranial magnetic stimulation. But I became more interested in the self-report measures that we were using, psychometrics and computational linguistic analysis. So I did my doctoral training with Marty Seligman, who was particularly interested, and we worked together on how very brief positive experiences can have very long-lasting, even positively transformative effects. So the measures that we used and we developed, I found very illuminating, but the problem was we couldn't model these experiences in the lab. We couldn't induce them. So brain stimulation didn't work, forms of meditation didn't seem to work, virtual reality didn't work. And so I became fixated on psychedelic substances as a way to induce these kinds of positively transformative experiences. And I cited for many years Roland Griffith's work and his team at Hopkins. And so when Roland asked me to join his new center, I dropped everything and finished my dissertation, and I've been there and very grateful to be there ever since. And so today, the research that I'll present on psychedelics does have a bit of a bias. I am at the Center for Psychedelic and Consciousness Research at Hopkins, and I try to include research from a number of different sites, but it is a bit Hopkins centric, so I admit that bias up front. And really, this is just an opportunity for me to use this spinny wheel to show that we're focusing on psychedelics today. And in particular, most of the research that I'll cover is on psilocybin, the word used for what most people use the word magic mushrooms. It's the active ingredient in magic mushrooms. So psychedelics are a subject that lead to many subjects. They open a number of different levels of analysis, all the way from the pharmacology to clinical applications to sociocultural considerations. And so what I want to do today is take you on a tour through these various levels of analysis, but I will emphasize the subjective effects and the treatment efficacy a bit more than these other levels. But it's all just to say that there are a lot of ways into this topic, and a lot of interdisciplinary collaboration is not only important here, but I think absolutely necessary. Much of what I'll talk about today is described in a review article that was published just a few minutes ago, actually, in JAMA. It's a viewpoint that I wrote with my advisor, Roland Griffiths, but also with my wife, who's a resident in psychiatry at the University of Pennsylvania. So this is a review article that also includes some recommendations, and I'll touch mostly on those recommendations at the end. But if you're interested in the gist of what I'm talking about, it is covered in this article. So let's start with some history, specifically some ancient history. So a lot of times the story of psychedelic research begins in the 60s. But it's becoming ever more increasingly obvious that the story begins much, much earlier, hundreds or thousands of years earlier, that very high quality archaeological evidence has shown that there was ritual, ceremonial psychedelic use in ancient Greece, including Periclean Athens. These were the Eleusinian mysteries. As well as in South America, ayahuasca has been used for thousands of years, which chemical analyses has shown in the pouches of shamans. And in Mexico, for at least hundreds of years, mushrooms with psilocybin have been ingested in ritual religious contexts. Moving to the 20th century, on the left, you see Albert Hofmann, the Swiss chemist who synthesized LSD for the first time, which led to a number of research paradigms elucidating serotonin and indirectly leading to the discovery of SSRIs. In the middle, this extraordinarily silly looking man is Gordon Wasson, a New York City banker who was an amateur mycologist who brought psilocybin mushrooms back from Mexico, and a number of researchers used. And then, of course, we know the story of the recreational adoption of psychedelics by the subculture in the 1960s and the subsequent clampdown of government regulations and the resulting prohibition, which has lasted to the present day in large part. This brings us to the last couple of decades. where we've seen a resurgence, some say renaissance, in psychedelic research due to some of the loosening of the restrictions around the use of psychedelics for research purposes, largely started at Johns Hopkins in healthy, normal people, but elsewhere as well. And I've made this slide a week or so ago, but I think that there's been new centers, even since I've made this slide, there seem to be popping up all over the world. In addition to Hopkins, a major hub is Imperial College London, as well as University of Zurich. And I'll review research from both of these centers. But there are ongoing trials at a number of different medical schools across the country and the world now. And psilocybin for mood disorders has been designated a breakthrough therapy, which removes some hurdles in the regulatory process, bringing psilocybin as a potential treatment option. So let's get more specific about what we're talking about in terms of psychedelics, looking at the molecular structure of some of the most common psychedelics compared to serotonin. You'll see some real similarities in the structure of these molecules. You may have to squint a little bit to see it. So here's a zoomed image with some highlights. And psychedelics do indeed act on serotonin receptors. Specifically, they're partial agonists for 5-hydroxytryptamine, or 5-HT, and specifically 2A, although there's some 1A action as well. But the main psychological effects seem to be conveyed through this 5-HT2A receptor mechanism. So some evidence for this 5-HT2A action. This is from David Olson and his team. David Olson prefers the term psychoplastogen to psychedelic due to the neuronal growth and synaptogenesis and resulting neuroplasticity that occurs through this process. I personally don't think psychoplastogen is going to catch on over psychedelics. I think that ship has sailed many decades ago, but he's really pushing the term. And it does highlight an extremely important process. So in an elegant series of studies, Olson and his team, this study, the first author was Lai, showed that various 5-HT2A agonists, these psychedelics, increased the number of dendritic branches over the control of the vehicle. And then the question became, if you selectively antagonize 5-HT2A receptors, what happens? Does this effect persist? And it does not. And I'd point you to this publication. There's really a number of studies in vivo and in vitro showing this effect and related effects. Vollenweider out of University of Zurich, to zoom out a little bit, provides a model with some of the main effects. First, you see some of this neuroplasticity related effects due to glutamate release and BDNF. And you see the increased synaptic plasticity, specifically in the prefrontal cortex. There's also interesting activity in the Raphe nucleus that I'm particularly interested in, but I won't focus on. What this team focuses on is changes to the cortical thalamic network coupling, specifically that there's changes to thalamic sensory gating, which disrupts a number of networks between thalamus and cortex. Still, I think that the status of these theories are highly speculative, but this paper by Vollenweider and Preller is fairly recent and provides a very nice summary for those of you interested in this model. Turning to some promising preclinical findings, specifically in rodents. I think this is a cute little summary image that was included with this article. This is Chuck Nichols and his team at LSU comparing the effectiveness of psilocybin and ketamine versus control on a depression model in rodents, depression in quotes, because that was operationalized here by the forced swim test task where a rodent is dropped into a tube of water and immobility is taken to be a sign of defeat and therefore quote unquote depression. And what you see in this task at 7 days is that both ketamine and psilocybin showed reductions in immobility, which is a good thing, and increases in swimming, which is also a good thing in this task. And so you're seeing psilocybin and ketamine effective at day 7. But what about when you look a month later, not just a week later? Here we see day 35, and now ketamine and control are equally ineffective, and psilocybin remains effective for less immobility and more swimming. There is some more preclinical research, but let's move to humans, specifically some of the physiological effects of psilocybin. What's interesting about these effects, I think, is how uninteresting they are. There are transient increases in heart rate and blood pressure, some mild headaches, but intriguingly, non-toxic and non-addictive. So let's look at each of these in turn. First, for blood pressure and heart rate, you see the typical time course of the acute effects of the substance, something about 6 to 7 hours. And you see at the highest dose, some mild cause for concern lasting for an hour or two, but not really. These are really within the range of normal oscillations. So nothing to worry about clinically, although these are measured and monitored in clinical settings. Something very reliable are dose-dependent headaches. These are mild, but they are reported by large percentages of people in clinical settings. These are mild and generally treated with basic over-the-counter NSAIDs. Surprisingly non-toxic. So I'll go through very briefly 3 case studies of individuals who took many, many times a normal dose of psilocybin. These range from 50 to 500 times an average recreational or clinical dose. I mean, obviously 50 to 500 times of pretty much any recreational substance would lead to death. So it's sort of fascinating that the physiological effects were so minor. In each case, these individuals accidentally ingesting 50 to 500 times the recommended dose were hospitalized, but no life support or any kind of extraordinary measures were needed. The first case was an individual who snorted what was LSD, but what she thought was cocaine. She had a history of bipolar, a number of cases of mania. The only persisting effect that she reports was that she never again experienced an episode of mania. So sort of interesting, lingering positive effect maybe. The second case was accidental ingestion many times a recommended dose in a woman in her first week of the third trimester of pregnancy. And the birth and the child were completely normal. There were no issues in either regard. The last case was an individual with opiate use disorder who reported withdrawing from the substance with no withdrawal symptoms and not using the substance again. I think that was on the follow-up was just a few months later. So we'll get to some of the risks and negative effects of psychedelics. And these case reports probably seem too good to be true. And that probably is the case, but it's also fascinating to see what that enormous overdoses are resulting in basically mildly positive effects. And there appears to be no reward circuit activation involved with the psychedelics we're talking about today. And so they appear to not have addictive potential. I'll talk about some neuroimaging findings. Most notable for many, I think, here will be the findings that I don't talk about. In Michael Pollan's otherwise, I think, fantastic book, How to Change Your Mind, he talks about the default mode network inactivation that occurs in individuals who have taken psychedelic substance. And many of us think that these findings are far too non-specific, that there's default mode network inhibition in a number of psychoactive substances. And so it's non-specific to psychedelics. And it's also not consistent even among psychedelics. Lastly, the reverse inference from reduced default mode network activity to subjective effects of ego dissolution seem like much too far of a reverse inference. So all of that's to say, if you hear about the psychedelic effects on the default mode network and that somehow explaining something important, I would suggest a healthy dose of skepticism about those claims. What does seem like a pretty reliable effect is increased resting state functional connectivity. So correlating signals across brain regions. There does seem to be more robust functional connectivity across a number of networks. And here you see a popular image of floating orbs representing signals from various brain regions and their higher density of interaction under psilocybin. So now turning to something I know a bit more about, set and setting. Set and setting is a term that I think is pretty widely known now, but set refers to mindset, being expectations, which can occur from one's own idiosyncratic knowledge and understanding, but more generally cultural messages and of relevance to the clinical work that we'll talk about. These seem to be highly malleable from clinicians and clinical messaging. Setting is the context, both physically and socially. And so let's first talk about non-clinical settings in which psychedelics are commonly used. Wondering if anyone knows what this picture is of. This is kind of a contemporary psychedelic mecca. This is Black Rock City, Burning Man. And some recent field research that sounds like a fun lab assignment by Molly Crockett's group at Yale. They went to a number of Burning Man festivals and festivals like it and set up a little lab and asked people about their psychoactive substance use. And in this context, you see about 1 in 4 people using psychedelics at least once during the week, and in many cases multiple times. But when you look at, this is a national survey on drug use. This is, I believe, seniors in high school. The rate of lifetime use is much lower. Conservatively, if you combine these together, something like 15%. Of course, with Oregon and other locations decriminalizing psilocybin mushrooms, you'll see that this lifetime use is about to increase dramatically, at least in those locations. So there are ED visits from psychedelic use. Curious how many people here have interacted with a case of someone visiting the ED from psychedelic use. I assume many, but it's important to get a sense of the scale. So this is from the Drug Abuse Warning Network. And you see there are indeed known ED visits from psychedelics across each of these various psychedelic substances. But I want to draw your attention to, in terms of scale, that these are visits per 100,000 drug-related visits. And so this is on far less than 1%. It's something like 0.00007% of drug-related visits are due to psychedelic use. So important to appreciate the risks, but also put them in proportion. There was a survey done at Hopkins trying to get a better understanding of these challenging experiences, as they're called here. So this was a survey conducted that asked specifically for people to respond who have had a challenging or difficult psychedelic experience. So of these respondents, about 40% rated the experiences as among the most challenging of their entire life, and 11% reported putting themselves or others at risk or physical harm. So sobering figures here. Again, this is not at all a representative sample. This is targeted specifically on people who have had a very challenging experience, but this is just to underscore that negative experiences can and do occur. So here is a figure from that same survey showing how difficult or challenging the experience was. But there's something interesting about this characterization of challenging or difficult, because self-reported challenging, so self-reporting an experience as being challenging in a clinical setting is also correlated with the therapeutic outcomes of the experience. So here are some other figures from that same survey showing that even among those who said their experience was challenging, it was also among the most personally meaningful, and the vast majority of these experiences showed enduring changes in the positive direction to personal well-being or life satisfaction. So more on that in a bit, but first let's look at again contextualizing the risk of harm from psychedelics. This was work done by David Nutt and others showing across, I think, 16 different indicators, harm to users and harm to others. And when you find psychedelics on this rating of recreational drugs, it's at the very bottom. And so there are real risks and dangers from recreational non-clinical use, but they appear to be lower than many of the most common recreational substances, including many that are legal. some intriguing evidence of some positive effects when looking epidemiologically at lifetime psychedelic use. One of the only or a few significant effects pop out. One of the most interesting, I think, is those who have used psychedelics report fewer suicide attempts. This also holds true for psychological distress and past year suicidal thinking. And classic psychedelics, these are the serotonergic psychedelics like psilocybin here, are the only recreational psychoactive substance that has this positive sort of protective effect. So now let's turn from non-clinical settings to clinical settings. This is my home base, Behavioral Pharmacology Research Center. And here, the situation surrounding psychedelic experiences is very carefully curated and much different from many of these recreational uses. So here, there are a number of preparatory sessions to build rapport between therapists and patients, as well as to do psychoeducation about the experience itself. A lot of that has to do with that it will be quite intense, but that it will pass. And that goes to the from the macro to the micro. So even scary or difficult or challenging thoughts and emotions may be intense, but they too shall pass, so to speak. And then there are a number of integrative sessions where patients, participants are encouraged to discuss any insights or profound moments of their experiences and to connect their experiences to their life and behavior in a very concrete way. This is what the dosing room or the session room looks like. I'm not sure if this is a posed photo or not, but it's relatively typical. There's always two guides present. Participants can ask for a therapeutic touch, which is a handhold. But there's otherwise really not much interaction between guides and participants. Guides are asked to limit conversation to the absolutely bare minimum so that participants can go inward, so to speak, and to appreciate their experience. They're listening to music. There's a recent article on the actual playlist that's used at Hopkins and NYU. And their participants are asked to put on eye shades. So what about challenging experiences in this clinical context? Many participants do endorse that the experience was challenging, which interestingly correlates with therapeutic effectiveness to a small degree. And there have been no instances of lasting adverse effects so far. And that so far is a big caveat because of course there will be. And the samples that have been used in these clinical studies, as we'll see, are very specially selected to have no real family history of mental illness to speak of, which of course is highly unusual in and of itself. But it is striking, I think, that after 1,000 or so participants, there's been no instances of lasting adverse effects as of yet. Here's a participant describing their experience, which I think helps to illustrate how something could be both positive and therapeutic and yet also challenging, although this will be of not surprising at all to the psychotherapists here. But here's a participant saying it's not fun. That's the thing. It's a hard experience. It's very rich. You have a lot of things to learn from it, but how much fun is learning, Yeah, learning is hard. there's something about this experience that is hard, and participants struggle to say that it's fun, and this probably speaks to the lack of addictive potential as well. Very few people after running a marathon are ready to run another one the next day. So let's talk a bit about the subjective effects, or the trip, so to speak, a word that my advisor, Roland Griffiths, absolutely hates and never uses. But what do these experiences feel like? Well, here's what other people in the room think the experience feels like to participants. So these are observer ratings. You see orderly dose effects and orderly temporal effects. You see the peak happening at about 2 hours or 3 hours into the experience, after that quick ascent, and then a slow and steady decrease for overall drug effect, as well as for joy and intense happiness, and those track one another. Now, what about the self-report from the participants themselves? In the first panel, you see anxiety and fearfulness. So again, speaking to the challenging nature of these experiences, you do see in the psilocybin group, compared to the methylphenidate group, those who are given Ritalin as an active control, you see more anxiety and fearfulness in the psilocybin group, a bit more, but also much more joy and intense happiness. So the high arousal positive emotions, as well as low arousal positive emotions like peace and harmony. Here's another way of looking at the subjective effects in a more fine-grained way. This is the 5-DASC, or the 5-dimensional altered states of consciousness questionnaire. And again, you see orderly dose effects and large endorsement of visual alterations, of synesthesia, vivid imagery, as well as characterizing the experience as blissful and one involving deep feelings of unity. And that deep feeling of unity is something that's intrigued a number of scientists and even scholars. This has traditionally been referred to as a mystical type experience. And there's a mystical experience questionnaire that was developed by Fred Barrett, Matt Johnson, and Roland Griffiths, and others, that has built on a number of similar psychometric instruments by Ralph Hood and others. This mystical experience questionnaire, which I'll show a number of findings from today, comprised of 30 Likert-style items, decomposes into 4 factors. The first factor involves a deep sense of unity, or of being pure awareness somehow. Other factors include positive mood, deep feelings of awe and amazement, a transcendence of time and space. So the sense of time dilates, the sense of space becomes, boundaries become a bit fuzzy. And then the final factor is ineffability, that the experience somehow goes beyond words. And here's a participant from the study, the 2006 study comparing psilocybin and methylphenidate. I have read thousands of these descriptions, and this is pretty typical. So feeling of no boundaries, where I didn't know where I ended and where my surroundings began. Somehow I was able to comprehend what oneness is. So obviously not on an intellectual level, but in a feeling mode. So what other contexts do you see accounts like this? Where did your mind go? Usually you don't see this in a psychopharmacology lab or in a treatment room. I think for most people, we think of religious or spiritual contexts, people on, say, meditation retreats, for example. So here is a religious studies scholar, Houston Smith, who posed the following question to a class at Princeton. One of these is drug-induced from a psychedelic, and the other occurred spontaneously. So I don't know if in the chat, if you're able to put in the chat, if you could guess which one of these two accounts you believe is psychedelically induced. Just put a 1 or a 2 if you feel like guessing. Or just make the guess in your own head. Oh, good, people are guessing. And I just pulled up the chat, and I'm seeing it almost 50-50. Although maybe in this group a bit more leaning towards 1. And if that's the case, you are right. Most groups, it is about 50-50. So the first of these is an individual describing their psychedelic experience. The second of these comes from The Varieties of Religious Experience, a book by William James that provides hundreds of accounts of profoundly altered states of consciousness that are felt to be highly meaningful and in most cases positively impactful. So this book is a real classic in the scientific and scholarly study of these experiences. And yeah, as Mike mentioned, I've submitted a book that tries to bring many of James's insights forward while also reviewing some of the relevant research that's been done on this topic. And it now forefronts psychedelics towards the end. But psychedelics are not the only contexts that trigger these experiences, as we just saw. Here is a large general social survey question. Have you ever felt as though you were close to a powerful spiritual force that seemed to lift you out of yourself? 40% of the population in the US said they completely agree with this statement, which I find shockingly high. And here's a Gallup poll with a similar but slightly differently worded version of this. I've had a profound religious experience or awakening that changed the direction of my life. So 41%, the US population says they completely agree with this statement. In some of my work, I've asked people to describe a mystical type experience and to indicate what triggered it. Interestingly, in this particular study, it was the first time I included grief on this list of triggers as a result of some qualitative work I'd been doing. And interestingly, it was the top trigger, which I think, there's not much research on this, but I think I find this finding absolutely fascinating. Prayer and meditation, maybe more predictable. But you also see a psychedelic drug as being among the top triggers of these kinds of experiences. If you try to find a kind of red thread of similarity between these triggers, it's, I think, difficult or impossible. If something comes to mind, please let me know. So, do psychedelics reliably trigger mystical experience? It seems that they do. Here is the study comparing methylphenidate to psilocybin, showing a very large effect with psilocybin. This is the total score of the mystical experience questionnaire. And here, I think, is one of the most interesting figures in all of psychology for the past 20 years. This is showing that 2/3 of the sample said that their experience lying on a couch in the BPRU with eye shades on for 6 hours was among the most meaningful experiences of their entire lives, up there with childbirth and marriage. I think that's absolutely astounding. And I think we're still working out the implications of this finding. So can this be harnessed to treat mental illness? The idea of the time course here is something like an experience that occurs in the order of a few hours. There appears to be a critical period that's called the afterglow period. It might be a critical window of plasticity. I think there's some interesting work happening on that in the preclinical rodent research world, as well as in the clinical work. And then residual effects long term. We see that some of these effects last weeks, months, or even years. And how that's possible, whether it's neurobiologically mediated entirely, if there's cognitive changes or changes to identity that occur, I think all of this needs to be worked out and represent open questions to pursue. So let's look first at an RCT on well-being. We've already seen some data from this, comparing Ritalin with psilocybin. I guess I wanted to use a more fun little figure there. So this table shows a number of effects. It's a little busy, so let's walk through it one step at a time. What you see is positive persisting effects indicated by these red arrows. These are attitudes about life and/or self. I forget that there's actually a typo in this, this manuscript. Positive mood changes, altruistic positive social effects, and behavior changes. These are huge effects. I calculated the Cohen's d. I think all of these are over 3. Many of them are over 4. Really large effect sizes. And no increases in these negative changes. I want to draw your attention to the bottom of the screen for this variable, the community observer ratings. So participants nominated someone from their life, maybe a neighbor who was blind to condition, who the research team followed up with about the participants' positive changes in mood and behavior. And this observer variable was also highly significant and also holds at a 14-month follow-up, which I find remarkable. So let's move into an open label study. This is on treatment-resistant depression. This was done by the Imperial College London group. Open label, so no control group, but promising findings. Many of these participants were severely depressed, and all but one moved out of the severe depression range, and many in the sample had no depression still at 3 months. So certainly promising findings. And here they use the 5-dimensional altered states of consciousness questionnaire. And you see that there is a correlation between the state of consciousness during the session itself and the follow-up in terms of the treatment efficacy. So people who rated higher on experience of unity, spiritual experience, bliss, insightfulness, those were the ones who responded to treatment best. And we'll see that we'll look at this correlation with the subjective effects with lasting treatment outcomes in a few different ways. So next, a couple of RCTs, one based at Hopkins, one at NYU. And the population here is individuals who had just received life-threatening cancer diagnosis, who are suffering from some symptoms of depression and anxiety as a result. And to cut to the chase, across both groups, there was a significant clinical response in the vast majority of participants. So this was a high dose, which is really a normal dose of psilocybin compared to a placebo-like dose of psilocybin. By the way, I should mention, many people think that the dose that's given in these clinical contexts would be lower than an average recreational dose, but the opposite is true. The clinical dose is much higher than is typically taken even recreationally. It's referred to as a heroic dose. And so participants do seem to respond best to fairly large doses. Here's a participant from this study saying, "It was like being inside of nature, and I could have stayed there forever. It was wonderful. All kinds of other things were coming too, like feelings of being connected to everything. I mean, everything in nature." Some participants do interpret the experience in a spiritual or religious way. Other participants don't. They interpret it in terms of feelings of connection, often with other people and nature. A recent depression study, this came out just a couple of weeks ago in JAMA. This is an RCT. And here we see strong, significant effects, reductions in Hamilton depression scores from baseline to 1 week after, and then persisting for 4 weeks after dosing. There seems to be a transdiagnostic effectiveness to psychedelic substances. We'll look at a couple of studies for substance use disorder, starting with nicotine use disorder. This is just an open label study from a few years ago. And in this study, we see 15 of the 18 participants were abstinent according to biomarkers. So these are not self-report treatment outcomes. And this persisted for 6 months, whereas only 3 of the participants went back to smoking. This is much more effective than the most effective current nicotine use disorder treatment. And even in this case, so these participants, unlike some of the initial studies who were interested in receiving psychedelic treatments, reportedly were not all that interested in psychedelics per se. They just wanted to stop smoking. But even here, you see this kind of oneness with the universe being reported. Interestingly, feeling being forgiven, rich joy and awe. Another open label study for alcohol use disorder, this is by the NYU group, showing substantial and sustained reductions in drinking days overall, as well as heavy drinking days. So this leads us to some of the therapeutic mechanisms that might be occurring here. So what is mediating these outcomes? I won't really have much to say here because this is a really ongoing area of investigation, and we just don't know very much about what is going on. Here are some possibilities. Emotion processing, so there does appear to be a reduction of processing of negative stimuli and less reactivity to social exclusion and negative emotion. And this does seem to be mediated by less coupling between amygdala and other regions. Social processing, there does seem to be increased empathy, a reduction to reduced rejection sensitivity that was measured by the cyberball task, where basically you're playing catch with 2 other what you think are participants, and they never throw the ball to you, and people get upset and feel excluded, and people after taking psychedelics didn't seem all that bothered by this. Self-processing, there is this reduction of self-salience and ego dissolution even. The self can seem very unimportant and even fade from awareness entirely. So what's going on here? Potentially normalization of negative bias, uh, perhaps reduced rumination because of reduced focus on the self, maybe something to do with rapport, reduced social withdrawal is possible, and reinstatement of reward processing. By the way, each of these are highly speculative, and they're suppositions based on pretty limited research at this point. Uh, Something that's continues to be extremely interesting is the fact that how people score on session day, how they describe uh, in terms of psychometrically, how they describe their subjective experience is predictive of outcomes weeks and months later. And specifically using the mystical experience score, you have really high predictive validity from the session itself. And so really finding ways to maximize that experience, understanding the parameters that lead to higher and lower scores, I think is really interesting, as well as understanding the mechanisms of this subjective state and these later therapeutic outcomes, something I understand Jessica Nielsen is working on. I'm really excited by her work and looking forward to see the results. Future directions. Well, this is a field that seems to be exploding. There has been a lot of interest at all of the levels of analysis that we've discussed today. There are a number of ongoing trials. These are just those happening at Hopkins. I've lost track of all of those happening around the world, certainly dozens. So all of this raises the question, what's next in terms of clinical relevance? Will we see something like a psilocybin prescription? And personally, I think the answer is yes. I think that within 5 to 10 years, psychiatrists will be able to prescribe a psychedelic session, specifically using psilocybin and specifically for mood disorders and maybe substance use disorders following that decade time frame. But a lot can go wrong. And so I think some of the things that come specifically to mind is the unfortunate tendency of our society to politicize science. And so there, in the 1960s, for example, there were a number of serious scientists doing great work on this topic, and there was a lot of excitement, and all of that changed very quickly. So I think it's still possible that politicization can cause this renaissance, so to speak, to go off the rails. That includes excess enthusiasm as well as excess alarmism. So there are real risks involved here, and these are not cures for mental disorders. And you are seeing people make extraordinary claims without extraordinary evidence to back them up. But on the other hand, there are still real alarmists, people making claims about the dangers of psychedelics that don't seem to match the data. Lastly, I think this is an area that maybe more than most may attract non-empirically based therapeutic paradigms. And I think it's absolutely essential that evidence-based gold standard practices be applied clinically to psychedelics, and that no exceptions for quality of clinical application be made despite psychedelics' seemingly exceptional potential. And so that's it for me here. I'm looking forward to your questions, and thank you so much for having me and for your attention.
Thank you, Dr. Yaden, for an excellent, well done presentation. I'm going to try to moderate a question and answer period, and I apologize ahead of time to those who I mispronounced their names.
Yeah. And please call me David.
Okay, David. Um, Initially, Candy Yatsky asked, are you aware of the work of Charles Rayson, University of Wisconsin-Madison, and Andrew Penn, University of California, San Francisco?
Yes, I am. I'm guessing that this is in regards to the idea of um, psychedelics with no subjective effects, and whether the subjective effects can be removed uh, from the treatment and the therapeutic effects remain. I'm not sure, but I assume that. Yeah. So David Olson, who's some of his work I presented towards the beginning, having to do with neurogenesis, um, he invited Roland Griffiths and I to write a viewpoint arguing that the subjective effects are necessary for the therapeutic effects of psychedelics. And he wrote the counter viewpoint saying that the subjective effects are not necessary. And we may have some preliminary evidence in the near future from Dr. Raisin and others, because I think he's testing this with some way of interfering with memory of the session day and looking to see if the therapeutic effects persist. I think this needs to be tested a bit more robustly than that, but still we'll get some interesting pilot data on that question. I find it sort of intuitively inconceivable that taking the subjective effects out of the equation will leave therapeutic benefits lasting months or a year. But I'm very open to being wrong on that, and maybe I'll be forced to eat crow sooner than I think. But I think it's a really fascinating question, and I think really needs to be tested, maybe in a paradigm involving administering psychedelics under general anesthesia.
Candy commented that, yes, you interpreted her question correctly when you answered it.
Okay.
Jessica Nielsen commented that the three cases that you talked about early on were actually about LSD overdose, not psilocybin.
Right. Yeah, good clarification.
We have an anonymous question. What are some of the side effects of the psychedelic drugs? Not just the psychological side effects, but the physical side effects as well.
Let's see. So persisting physical side effects, maybe apart from blood pressure and heart rate, I'm guessing.
I assume.
Unclear. There are some people who this sort of small interest group that is promoting the reality of persisting effects to their visual perception, that for weeks or months after their experience, they're seeing sort of visual trails and other strange effects. The incidence of this from epidemiological research seems to be vanishingly small. It's never been seen in a clinical context. So that is a possible persisting side effect, but it seems at this point to be extraordinarily rare.
Jessica Nielsen asks, can you talk more about the religious leaders psychedelic study?
Yeah, so this was a study that was done at Hopkins where religious leaders or religious professionals were recruited, ministers, priests, rabbis, an imam, and they were administered psilocybin in their standard treatment protocol. And the idea here is to look at their interpretations of their own experiences based on their very strong presumed expectancies based on their faith tradition and their deep knowledge of doctrine in their tradition, to see how these expectancies might impact their experience, or their experience might impact their interpretations, perhaps even of their own faith tradition. Yeah, the idea here is to try to get a better sense of the kind of cultural blind spots that may may exist in researchers and clinicians. For example, the mystical experience questionnaire does not involve any mention of the word God, but many of the participants do mention the word God. Most of those participants are religious and spiritual themselves and would likely interpret many experiences involving God, but that would downplay, I think, a very real association that many people have between the psychedelic experience and a religious or spiritual experience. The other aspect is to just see whether the well-being effects replicate in this particular population. So there are a number of questions involved. Some of them are replication questions, but many of them are qualitative to try to get a better sense of what this particular population has to say about their experiences.
I have a question, David. Thank you for a really superb talk. Super informative and very kind of just thoughtful and scholarly. So my two questions, my first one is, have there been any studies of the, one could call them cognitive, but I would include social cognitive effects at a fairly, elemental information processing level? So for example, is either during the actual period of the high, that's probably a term researchers hate, but whatever the term is you use, of the dosing effects, and or subsequent, so kind of pre-post changes in things like attention, cognitive control, social cognition abilities. So curious about that. Visual perceptual abilities, auditory perceptual abilities. And then the second question is, it almost sounds too good to be true, right? These effects, these incredibly beneficial effects in light of like zero side effects. And the fact that everything can be treated, and treated well. So as someone who's close to the research, can you just comment on that piece as well?
Yeah, both great questions. The first one having to do with tasks, looking specifically more information processing, socio-emotional tasks, even basic perceptual tasks. Sort of shockingly little, at least in our center so far. That's about to change in a very huge way. There's a big effort to basically bother these participants even more than they're already being bothered. And they're extremely cooperative, and I feel really grateful for these participants. They're answering tons and tons of questions, but now they'll be providing a number of biological samples, and they'll be sitting for a number of tasks. Some of the people in our psychology department who work on perception are getting involved. And we have some experts in memory paradigms on board. A lot of this was derailed. We would have had quite a bit more evidence, but the pandemic has, of course, stopped data collection. So we may have to wait another year for that. But I think that a whole lot of data that you'll be interested in is on its way. And in terms of this seeming too good to be true, I mean, I absolutely agree. I think that we're in danger of being in a hype bubble right now. I think, which is in part the reason for this this JAMA viewpoint. Is to get people to calm down a little bit and to recognize that a lot of these studies are open label. And even the RCTs, it's very difficult to get an appropriate control group. Usually people can see right through the control. It's not always the case. The methylphenidate group, I think, retain their blind pretty well. It also is very difficult to provide the same exact level of clinical support to each group, especially when blinding it doesn't survive. And so I think that we'll see larger RCTs with better controls. For example, Jessica Nielsen mentioned to me this morning the idea of the active control being high dose THC, which I think, that's on the order of the right kind of active control. So I think we'll see larger RCTs with much better controls, and in participants who are less motivated to participate in a psychedelic trial. And when all of that happens, I think we'll see much lower effect sizes. I still think we'll see efficacy, but I think the effect sizes will be adjusted downward substantially. I also think that the natural experiments that are happening now in Oregon and elsewhere, where there's recreational use of psychedelics being decriminalized, I think that we'll see a lot of risks emerge. I think we'll see hospital room visits. I actually think some of that can be mitigated by public education about these substances, which I think is lacking. But I think that it raises the possibility of ED visits and perhaps even first break psychoses occurring. So I think that we'll see our expectations adjusted downward in terms of the clinical effectiveness, and I think we'll see our understanding adjusted upward in terms of recreational risk.
David, Lydia Zalowski asks, what are your thoughts on one versus repeated psychedelic therapy sessions? Would you recommend repeated exposures?
Yeah, so usually I should have included that detail. There's usually at least 2 sessions that occur in most of these clinical treatment paradigms. And so those will be separated by a few weeks. In some cases, it's just 1. In other cases, it's 2. I think in a few cases, I'm not sure if I reported on those, there was even 3. So these do need to be spaced apart somewhat. First of all, people don't want to re-engage in this kind of experience immediately. That there's integration that occurs. But the benefit, I think, one way of thinking about it is in terms of this mystical experience type state, or this therapeutically optimal subjective state, that the drug administration provides a very fertile ground for a therapeutically beneficial experience to occur, raises the probability much higher than your average Tuesday afternoon. But that maybe what's needed is that therapeutically optimal state to occur. And so multiple dosing sessions allows for more possibility for that to happen. That's one way of thinking about it from a completely subjective effects centered kind of approach. In terms of the sort of neuroplasticity type lens, I don't really know, but it's possible that more dosages are better. But these schedules are entirely unstudied at this point in terms of what might be ideal.
Glenn Redman asks, how important do you think intention set and setting are to the efficacy of using psychedelics? For instance, is using something like, and he gave a specific name of a psychedelic that I can't pronounce, I'm sorry, but if you used a psychedelic at your home alone, divorced from indigenous group practice, is that less effective?
Yeah, maybe ayahuasca.
That's it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so I mean, I think there's I'm not sure if these are 2 ends of a spectrum, but the clinical context that has been curated at this point, it seems to be ideal in many respects. You have veteran clinicians, doing their utmost to make the experience feel as safe and as therapeutically optimal as possible. Maybe in the middle you have some of these non-clinical contexts like Burning Man, which at least is sort of maybe set up to be an okay container for these kinds of experiences. And then you have, people who have no idea what they're getting themselves into, experimenting with these substances and putting themselves and others at risk, like driving around, for instance. So yeah, the set and setting absolutely matters in an absolutely enormous way. It couldn't be overstated how much it matters. There is still, though, this question of what kinds of properties are inherent to the substance and the way it interacts with our cognitive systems and our physiology. There are reports, for example, of polydrug users who kind of accidentally take psychedelics, well, at least not with any kind of intentionality around it. And there are reductions in addictive behavior for a few weeks following those doses. So there may be the kind of anti-addictive property that occurs regardless of set and setting. I think that's quite possible. In the 1960s, MK Ultra was a CIA program that used psychedelics in a way where they were hoping to achieve mind control in political prisoners, and so they kind of created the worst possible set and settings, and they were completely unable to achieve their aim. They found that people actually became more resistant to divulging secrets in these settings. Ken Kesey, the author, who was a participant in one of these studies, and he describes being kind of stuck in a closet in a basement and given psychedelics, kind of the worst set and setting possible, but he describes a full-blown mystical experience that gave him a lot of positive benefit. So short answer is the set and setting absolutely matters. It can't be overstated, but the question remains of what kind of inherent properties these substances have for us.
Anonymous question here. Can you comment on current research involving MDMA to treat post-traumatic stress disorder?
I know that it's ongoing. I can't comment. I don't know very much about MDMA research or where it is in terms of the regulatory process. My informal understanding is that it's pretty far along and could become available in the next few years as a treatment option for PTSD, but others will know that better than I do.
Okay. Jessica Nielsen asks, can you speak about the training of the guides and therapists for the psychedelic dosing sessions?
Yeah, so this is very informal at this point. NYU received a grant to begin studying the training process. At Hopkins, there are some senior clinicians who do the training entirely in-house. There are a couple of training programs that I've seen. CIIS has one, I believe, and from my brief look into their program, it looks not all that evidence-based in terms of their curriculum, although they are bringing in guides who have a lot of experience at the research sites. So basically, it's a very informal process as of now. It's not been standardized. I think it's really important that it becomes studied and eventually standardized so that we can even compare results across sites and develop best practices. But yeah, there's no real formal training program as of yet.
Michael Paul Shalmo asks, in your work, how do you address the issue, if at all, of recruiting participants into psilocybin studies who are primarily interested in a recreational experience?
Well, they would be hopefully excluded. Well, it's hard to say the intentions of participants. These are, at least at Hopkins, these are usually there are flyers put out to the community. There's a large number of screening protocols in place across all kinds of mental, physical health, exclusion criteria. They are interacting with therapists for a number of hours. And so I guess the idea is that their motivations become clear. The amount of time and energy that they would need to invest into being a participant is pretty extraordinary. As I mentioned, we bother these participants with all manner of surveys and writing and starting now tasks and preparatory sessions and integration sessions. I think it would be far easier for them to spend $50 and buy some psychedelic mushrooms than to go through all of that hoopla to be a participant in a Hopkins trial.
An anonymous participant asks, I've heard that some clinicians describe feeling uncomfortable with the concept of ketamine, quote, gets people high, unquote. Are there similar considerations for a future where we are prescribing psilocybin or psychedelics rather?
Absolutely. I mean, DARPA has a huge process ongoing to try to take the psychoactive component out of psychedelics. We've mentioned others who are testing this as well using other means. I think people are very uncomfortable with this idea, mostly because things that people tend to enjoy psychoactively have addictive potential, and so I think it's a very reasonable concern, and actually ketamine does have addictive potential, so it makes sense that they would feel uncomfortable about getting patients high. With psilocybin, the addictive potential appears to be nearly non-existent. And there is intense joy, happiness, feelings of connection. But as I said, there's a challenging aspect to the experience as well, and so that may fit more within kind of a normal psychotherapeutic type approach, which is generally it's a challenging process to go through therapy, and that appears to be the case here as well. I think that there's just a lingering taboo about psychedelics, period, as well, which is also well-founded to some extent, although I think a lot of the propaganda isn't grounded in the data. I will say, though, that there seems to be a sea change in the way that psychedelics are being viewed. I think Michael Pollan's book and the 60 Minutes episode on psychedelics have actually changed a lot of people's minds very quickly. And I mentioned that we may be running into the opposite problem of there being a hype bubble that needs to be adjusted. So basically, I don't know. I assume that many that many providers will feel uncomfortable with psychedelics, but the results appear to be very promising, and people are looking for new treatment options as well.
David, it looks like we got about 2 or 3 minutes left, and we might not get to all the questions, but let's try. Are there any states that currently allow psychiatrists to prescribe psychedelic supported treatment? Or is it only clinical trials at this time?
Only clinical trials. In Canada, though, there's been some recent movement on allowing psilocybin to be used to support in palliative contexts, end of life contexts. So I'm not familiar with how the legislation is being played out at this point, because this has been a development that occurred just a few weeks ago. But it is a big change for Canada. But basically, no, it is not currently legal to administer this treatment in the U.S.
Okay. Jessica Nielsen comments and then asks for you to speak to this. Clinical versus ritualistic group settings, likely going to depend on the culture and population. Most psychedelic study research participants are white, and the contexts are far removed from their traditional uses in indigenous communities, and other communities are calling this out as a reason why you should not participate in these trials. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, so in terms of group, it is very expensive to engage, to provide this treatment. And some of the companies that are pioneering applying this, like Compass and Usona, are looking at group psychedelic administration as a way to reduce costs. And so those trials are ongoing, and so it's unclear. But it seems like the real spirit of the question is more about the cultural use of psychedelics in a number of different cultures I mentioned towards the beginning of the talk. And yes, maybe some concerns around appropriation, I suppose, of elements of the ritual use of these substances in medical contexts. I think that's a really interesting question that I think just requires more conversations to occur between these various communities. And, as I said, psychedelics are a topic that open up so many other topics, and the levels of analysis extend to anthropology and sociology. And so I think, those fields, and as well as religious studies. And so I think those fields will have a lot of studies and scholarship coming out on this very topic, which I really look forward to. The last part of the question having to do with using these in religious contexts or the religious component. Again, I think that's something that we're looking into with this religious professional study. And I think it simply requires, it not only lends itself to interdisciplinary research, it absolutely requires it. And so I'll look forward to, grappling with those issues going forward.
All right, that's the end of our questions, David. Thank you for a very great grand rounds, and it was a lot of interest here.
Thank you.
Questions?
Great attendance, great questions, great presentation. We're making it work despite having to do it remotely. Thank you so much, David. I'll be chatting with you later.
Great, looking forward. Thanks everyone again. I appreciate it.
Thank you everyone who attended. Bye-bye.
Bye.